Good morning, everyone. It's my privilege and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel event on livestock regulation in the context of the 2023 Farm Bill, if we have a 2023 Farm Bill. The regulatory issues that the panelists will be examining today are important to the US livestock industry's long-term economic health, to farm incomes, to consumer well-being in terms of the price you pay for your beef or pork or poultry, and US exports. These issues include whether mandating marketing channels and limiting contracting options for cattle, hogs, and poultry between farmers and processors benefits anyone, farmers, processors, or consumers. Whether country of origin labeling does anything for farmers in terms of higher farm gate prices or consumers in terms of product quality and other attributes of the commodities they buy in the meat counter. And whether policies mandating specific production environments that are often described as animal welfare initiatives generate benefits to either animals or human beings. So that's the frame of reference for this panel. And we're very fortunate to have four outstanding researchers to address these issues. Dr. Glyn Tonser, who will discuss marketing, channel, and contracting issues in the beef cattle industry, is professor of agricultural economics at Kansas State University. By the way, these introductions are going to be brief. Their bios are all available online to you. And I don't want to talk for longer than I have to. Dr. Barry Goodwin, who will examine contracting in the poultry sector, is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor of Agriculture and Resource Economics at North Carolina State University and visiting distinguished scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. The third speaker today is Dr. Daniel Sumner. Dr. Sumner is the Frank H. Buck Jr. Distinguished Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of California, Davis. And he will focus on the regulatory issues with respect to the treatment of animals. He'll be being streamed in and will not be here in person. But we're very grateful to him for being able to do that. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Michael Taylor, who is the Alpha Endowed Eminent Scholar at Auburn University. She will explore the evidence on the impacts of country of origin labeling, often called COOL, on farm gate prices, processors, consumers, and the competitiveness of US livestock producers in US domestic markets. It's also a particular pleasure to welcome Greg Dowd, former Chief Agricultural Negotiator in the Office of the United States Trade Representative, who will share his insights about these controversial issues from a policy, industry, and international trade perspective. The session proceeds as follows. Each speaker will provide a short assessment of the regulatory initiatives that they are experts about. Greg Dowd will then share his insights as commentator, followed by a brief discussion among the panelists, which I will moderate. The session will end with about 30 minutes in which we can take questions from the audience, both in the auditorium here at the American Enterprise Institute and online. For online participants, questions can be submitted either by email to benjamin.goren, Goren, at aei.org, or on Twitter to hashtag AEI Farm Bill, all one word. With that, I'm excited to have this panel begin, and we'll begin by listening to the insights from Glyn Tonser on the beef industry.
Very good. Thank you, Vince. Thanks for everybody that's here in person as well as online. Thanks for sharing your time with us this morning. I have a website. I'm a contributor to our website, agmanager.info. Everything I'm going to share with you here is cross-linked there and a lot of other related information. I encourage you to go there. I'm going to spend my limited time here talking about a couple of considerations when it comes to the Farm Bill in the beef cattle industry space. I'll further redirect you to a Meeting Place article. It was dated the fall, November, I believe, of 2021. So I had the honor to testify to the U.S. Senate in 2021, did a long interview with Meeting Place in their deep thought, thought leader segment. And I can't summarize everything in the 8 minutes, is why I'm redirecting you to that. But I pulled one of the quotes that was in that article to kind of set the stage for my comments, and I hope the broader panel today, is one of the quotes that was in that piece is, any good business plan or policy needs a clearly stated goal. And then I had some other, I'm sure, intelligent words in the middle. And then the quote ended with, and I think there are conflicting goals. And I want to start with that because obviously I think we all agree that policies need to have clearly stated goals. But at times, the reality of the impact of a policy doesn't align with the stated intentions, whether that's an unintended or something we didn't see coming kind of impact. And I want to highlight at least one of those in the cattle industry space. So I have here a slide that summarizes about 20 years of history of how cattle, and specifically fed cattle, so market-ready cattle in the U.S. industry, are marketing methods for those cattle. The red line you will see is grown. That is the formula transaction bucket. This would be one version of the contracting that Vince was alluding to earlier. Please note that about 20 years ago, we had 25, at times 30% of fed cattle transacted that way. Now 60 to sometimes 70%, these are national numbers, is the case. Conversely, the blue line is the one that gets talked about instead, is negotiated or traditional spot cash market. That was 50, 55% 20 years ago, and more recently hovers around 20% nationally. So that change is what I want to highlight on and share some thoughts about it. But before I leave this slide, please note the majority of that change happened in the first 10 years on this slide. So this is a 20-year history, but the majority of that switch from the blue to the red line happened before 2013, 2014. So it's not necessarily new that formulas are a heavy part of how we transact cattle, is the point of that comment. Some of the implications of that is fed cattle prices are actually higher in an era where we rely on formula transactions more. And these two scatter plots are geeky ways to make this point, but the summary point would be is in years where we had more spot negotiated activity, we actually had lower 5 market average fed cattle prices, what's up here. And conversely, in the years where we had a higher share that were formula, we had higher fed cattle prices. Now, this is not a causal statement on its own. This is just a scatter plot to kind of kick off this discussion. But I believe, and a lot of fellow economists would believe, this aligns with the change in the quality of the cattle that aligns with the quality of the beef signals. And the next couple of slides are going to drive that point home. So over the same time period here, we've had a notable increase in the number of steers and heifers that are graded choice or prime. And for those that don't live in this space, those are the higher quality animals. So the quality of animals has improved over this period of time. And I don't think it's by accident that that aligns with the move towards heavier use of formula. So this scatter plot right here has the share that are choice or prime across your horse and subsequent marketing, and then later the value-added components of how we get beef on the plate for a domestic or a foreign consumer. And negotiated spot transaction markets don't typically align well with that. So there's nothing surprising in the last 3 or 4 slides, but I want to impress on you the sort of quick summary of why we've moved towards more formula contracting-based production of cattle in the U.S. And that evolution is not done, and I think ongoing evolution is truly essential. I am the annoying guy that puts some things in caps, so essential is in caps here to drive that point home. Christine McCracken recently for Rabobank put in this quote in one of her releases, standing still can mean falling behind. I would encourage us to think exactly that way when it comes to this discussion. Policies that encourage us to either stand still or worse, go backwards, tend not to be economically fruitful. And there's many measures that point to ongoing consumer demand evolution. And I've just highlighted 2 of them here, and I'll verbally give you a couple more. The nasty bar chart that I've shared with you here is from a journal article with Ted Schroeder, Brian Coffey, and anybody that wants this, I can get a link to them on that. But what those bars summarize in English is a higher and higher share of cattle that are going through formula transactions have additional premium and discount considerations. So the frequency of a quality or a yield or a quote-unquote other consideration is growing over time. Now, other is very broad and generic. It's a catch-all in the AMS system. But regardless, more and more cattle are differentiated is the point, and that doesn't align with spot negotiated very well. The other chart here is something called protein values. I lead a project called the Meat Demand Monitor at K-State. It's beef and pork checkoff funded. The reason I highlight that here at the moment is taste and freshness are regularly found to be the key determinants of protein purchasing decisions in the U.S. And the ability to provide, in this case, beef products, but more generally meat protein, that aligns with those desires, that is tasteful and fresh, tends to align with the modern way of raising cattle and marketing beef more than traditional spot. Government's role has been expanding to bring us back to some policy-specific points. I'm not going to break these down, but I'll kind of tee this up if we want to talk about it in the panel Q&A. LMR, Livestock Mandatory Reporting, now has been around over 20 years. About every 5 years, there's a reauthorization, and it does evolve over time. We can talk about that more and what its role is if you like. LRP and LGM are programs that are subsidized insurance programs for the broader livestock industry, but feeder cattle and fed cattle is why I bring it up here, given my role here today. The role there has grown, particularly in the last 3 years, and we could talk about that if you like. But my summary suggestion, again, I'm trying to tee this off, is I would encourage policies to align with end user consumer demand signals. And this is both domestic, by the way, they're separate if it's retail or food service, but domestic as well as foreign demand. I would encourage policies to seek to leverage the actual comparative advantage of the U.S. beef cattle industry, and we could talk about that if you like. And then my last one, and this might ruffle some feathers, but I put this in green and underlined it. I encourage policies to be forward-looking, not backward-looking, and I intentionally bring in the pictures of the phones. I don't plan to carry around the phone to the left anytime soon. I have a 1-year-old iPhone, I'm already out of date. What's the point of that phone comment? We all appreciate the evolution that's happened with phones. Let's have that kind of logic on why we've evolved, how we raise livestock and why, what that means to the meat we produce, and let's keep that in mind as we're talking about policies. As promised, Vince, you can find my information on agmanager.info. Thank you.
Glenn, you get 10 out of 10 for the use of your time. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Barry Goodwin from North Carolina State University, and he will be further exploring some of the contracting issues that appear to be controversial for some members of the beef production sector and extremely important for others.
Okay, thanks, Vince, and thanks for putting this together. It's great panel here, and appreciate being involved, and everybody that showed up to listen to us this morning. Appreciate that. I'm going to talk about poultry and some of the issues that are being seen in the policy arena as it pertains to poultry, but also some wider policy issues that's related to the Packers and Stockyards Act. It's been around for a long time. And I want to talk about really three things that the Biden administration has put out as proposals for new policy and changes to the PSA, the Packers and Stockyards Act. And really this summary, I think, the quote really summarizes very well what the current message coming out of the administration is, that the meat and poultry processing sector is a textbook example of a lack of competition hurting consumers, producers, and our economy. And that lies behind a lot of the policy proposals that we're seeing. So I'm going to talk about this concentration issue a little bit. Of course, I'll say right up front, concentration can be consistent with price discrimination and market power, but it can also be consistent with economies of scale. And I think there's a lot of evidence that that's what we've seen driving a lot of the consolidation in the meat sector. I want to talk about the new rules for supporting the enforcement of the PSA, and then focus on the poultry tournament system, which is a rather unique way that poultry contracts are administered. So the proposals to strengthen the enforcement, as I said, they really come through three things. And this PSA has been around for a long time, the Packers and Stockyards Act, and everybody knows the old history of what was going on in the 20s in meat packing, and that's really what gave rise to this legislation. But it regulates meat packing and livestock markets and so forth. And the idea there is to, among other things, prevent price manipulation and a monopoly situation. And so the administration has proposed these three new rules. Only two of them have been released, to my understanding at least, unless something's happened very, very recently. But a new rule that will give clarity to strengthen enforcement of perceived unfair and deceptive practices. And then a poultry grower tournament system rule that I'll talk about. And then the third thing that's not out yet, as I understand it, is that it's a rule to clarify, this is a big one too, that can clarify that parties do not need to demonstrate harm to competition in order to bring litigation, a suit under the PSA. So that could be very big, and I'll talk about that. There's a lot of concerns about concentration. Another quote from the administration that this comes out in news releases fairly regularly, this sort of a message, and I won't read that, but it just talks about the fact that there's a lot of concentration, and it ties that back to what we all realize and have seen at the grocery store, that prices have gone up recently quite a bit. This is year-over-year price changes, and you can see there's been some large volatility there in the last recent period of time, but prices have also come back down somewhat. This is the 4-firm concentration ratio, which is a measure that's used a lot of times to provide a metric of concentration. It's the proportion of the market that the top 4 firms control or account for. And you can see that the message I wanted to get out with this is that, yeah, there is a high degree of concentration, but this is not new and it hasn't changed. This is, in fact, in some cases, you look at it, it's actually gone down over time, the amount of concentration. So, the administration's message is typically that the high prices are a result of this bad behavior by the industry and using their high degree of market power through a concentrated industry to price discriminate and squeeze farmers on one side and consumers on the other. It just doesn't fit with the evidence, really. That concentration has not changed that much. And you can look at the margins. I want, interest of time, won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can see here, this is pork and beef. And beef, there was some spikes here recently, but there's a lot of things changed during COVID, and I think a lot of what we see there is related to that. This is wholesale to retail. The previous one was farm to wholesale. And again, there's some modest increases there, but if you look at broilers, it's actually gone down over time. But by and large, this goes back to 1990. No major changes in real price margins that we see there. This is some work that Holly and I did with Dermot Hayes looking at gross margins. And again, this is in the pork sector, but margins have approached their 5-year average, really, and are back to what we saw pre-pandemic. So no great permanent changes there as well. So just very quickly, there's a lot on this slide. I'll summarize it. But the proposed rule, the first one coming out, is a rule on inclusive competition and market integrity. And I think the best way to summarize this is it's really sort of a social justice type of rule relating to the livestock industry, that the rule says we're going to protect market vulnerable individuals, and there's no real good definition of what that means, market vulnerable individuals. But, we're going to protect them from the risk of adverse exclusionary treatment in the marketplace, which may include on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, and religious affiliation. And it's not something that's terribly relevant, I think, to the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921. These practices are really largely prohibited by state and federal laws already. I think it's really going to introduce more confusion than anything else. Really, the proposed definition of a market vulnerable individual could allow a lot of individuals and entities to bring a claim under the PSA. We'll talk about poultry tournament contracts now. And the poultry industry, I think tournaments have been tried in other sectors, but it's really only stuck in the poultry industry. And it's really a very interesting way that these contracts work, and there's some very profound changes that are being proposed here from the Biden administration. So usually in agriculture, we think of these contracts as being some instrument of risk sharing, or it may be involving a particular type of management. But typically, it's a sharing of risk mechanism. And as I said, in livestock, tournaments are unique to poultry. And the way this works is integrators own the livestock. They provide the chicks, the feed, the veterinary services, all of the the poultry-specific inputs there, and they typically prescribe the production methods. And farmers, the producers, supply the facilities, the labor, the utilities, and the management. So there's a sharing arrangement there. The quality of the chicks has been refined over the years through very careful breeding. So it's a very, very specific quality depending upon the use. There's breeders that do this, and then the integrators will purchase those and put them under contract with the growers. And the terms of the contracts have been generally confidential. They vary in duration, and they could apply to a single flock or run for several years. And they're typically in the industry automatically renewed unless there's been some major violation of the terms of the contract. So the way it works really is that producers are rewarded using some metric or measure of their performance relative to other producers in the same area during a specific week. It's just what it sounds like with a tournament. Rewards are based upon your comparison to other producers that you're in the same general area, similarly situated producers. And they can look at feed efficiency, quality, veterinary cost, mortality is going to lessen the pounds delivered. Things like that is really mainly based on feed efficiency. And these can be done on a rank basis or cardinal measures. The administration several times, so many quotes I've seen that this tournament system is unfair, and Secretary Vilsack continually has said we need to change this to give farmers a fair shake. Typically there's a base payment and then premiums or discounts based upon this performance relative to other growers. Okay, two of my colleagues, sadly both retired now, Chuck Nober and Wally Thurman, did some fantastic research on this, and they found that these contracts really shift all of the systemic risk from the grower to the processor. And that would be things like production risk, weather, disease, et cetera, but specifically price risk as well. So tournaments encourage efficiency by their very nature. They also encourage technological improvements, trying to do everything you can to get a little bit better relative to your peers that you're being compared to. The integrators typically are guaranteed a given level of production, so it's a benefit for them. And growers are guaranteed a minimum level of compensation and an automatic market for their output. And growers are also guaranteed a supply of their inputs at a fixed cost known ahead of time. So some of the concerns here that are being raised, and some of them are reasonable, and some of them apply to tournaments, and some of them apply to contracts in general. But the guarantees and risk-sharing characteristics may only exist for the life of the contract. And when you have a very big multi-million-dollar investment in chicken houses, that can be a concern if you lose access to that integrator. An integrator can close the plant and stop accepting broilers. So that's a concern. Grow out can take from 38 to 61 days, and we've seen enormous improvements, very impressive over time in terms of the efficiency of feeding and growing the birds. But the growers are dependent on the integrator to give them the flocks to place on feed. And the growers in between flocks have to clean and repair their facilities and get ready for the next flock to come in. And this is another source of risk or concern because delays in getting that next flock can result in lost profits to the farmer. And so there's a lot of concern about how quickly that turnover occurs. Some research by Jim McDonald said that a 1 week difference between flocks would decrease your output by 1 extra flock a year. So it's important, and any delays there are going to affect the profitability of this for the grower. And I put a little check mark here for the things that are not just specific to tournaments, but really apply to any contract. A lot of these concerns do. You may not be able to see this, but these are characteristics. It's a bit dated. It's 2001 when, again, Jim McDonald did some work pulled out of the ARM surveys. This is really just a summary of the typical grower of poultry, the typical farm contracted growers. And well, there's a lot there that I won't try to unpack, but I'll just come over to look at really how they're doing in general. And this gives the lowest 20th percentile with the blue bars, the median, the 50th percentile, and the 80th percentile. And you can see, looking across the different quantiles, broiler producers that are growing under contract are doing quite well. You know, the higher quantiles, the over 80%, their typical income is $143,000. You can compare that to the typical farm household, and it's $568,000. And the point being, these growers are doing quite well, both relative to other U.S. farms and farm households in general. And if you look at this, the farm households are also doing better than the typical median for U.S. households. Okay. Again, this just looks at the mean weekly hours that they're supplying, and the point here that I was kind of taken with is that the labor requirements as they're reported in the ARM survey are quite low for this level of income that we're seeing. What are the changes that are being proposed? Well, there's a lot of requirement to turn over what could be perceived to be business confidential information, at least as I saw it. It's mandating disclosure of the information that's being used by the processor to determine the premiums and discounts that they're giving, and this would have to be given to all of the growers that are in a given group, so they know what they did relative to others and what everybody else is doing as well. And it's going to be mandate a lot of detail to be required: feed usage, placements, and this detailed ranking of growers within their tournament group. It's going to mandate reporting of their gross payments, breaking it down by their housing specifications and average payments in terms of dollars per square foot. Need to look at those payments over the last 5 years, and this information is broken down, again, by year, housing specification tier, and the quintile. So it's putting a lot of information out there that normally you would not think would be disclosed. There's also some requirements from the poultry dealer to have a disclosure document that reports really what their history has been, the number of flocks that the grower can expect, the stocking density, a summary of all litigation they've been involved in, bankruptcy filings, and so forth. If the grower makes some additional capital investments, there's additional information requirements that have to be disclosed by the integrator. A lot of these are like projections of what the payments will be going forward, and an explanation if those don't accurately reflect the averages, what the reasons why exactly, what the reasons would be, and a summary of all information that the integrator is going to collect and maintain from the grower. And here's the concerns with this. It's mandating disclosure, again, as I said, of this very extensive business confidential type information. And that's my verbiage, business confidential, but I think it really applies to this. This information would essentially make the details regarding individual production practices widely known, and it could be used to affect other aspects of the business practices among poultry farmers. As one example here, a lender would have access, very likely, to all the details for growers in their area, including the growers that they're not working with. We've seen a lot of litigation. I won't say too much about that, but AgriStats, if you hear of AgriStats ever, it immediately comes to mind a lot of litigation that's taking place. But their business model is really supplying a lot of this type of information in agricultural sectors to paying customers. And the argument is that, if you put this information out there, it can be used to conduct some nefarious, bad business practices that would harm growers. It's worked very well for growers, and they have higher incomes than other farmers, so you really wonder what's driving this proposal for change. It could really, if these proposals became mandated, it could negate all of these risk-sharing benefits of this tournament system. And you generally expect if you stop rewarding individuals for higher quality, the end result is going to be lower average quality across the board. So it could be a loss of efficiency. It could just really disrupt the market system that we have now. The third set of rules, again, it's still an OMB as I understand. It's the most concerning because it could radically change the marketing arrangements and lead to extensive litigation. This has come up before. This was introduced under the Obama administration, and the proposals have been rejected in the federal courts. The rule would clarify that parties do not need to demonstrate harm in order to bring legal action under the Packers and Stockyards Act. And right now, producers, just as a generalization, but they have to be harmed by unfair practices. To demonstrate that, they have to prove harm to the entire industry, to the market. And removing the requirement could really lead to a lot of extensive litigation. So this is a big one, and it's one that really, really bears careful monitoring. And I like this quote from the Kansas Livestock Association, Glenn, that the proposal is an attempt to ensure equal outcomes instead of equal opportunities. So.
Thanks. So we're going to switch focus a little bit to another area of regulation that involves the treatment of animals. And for that, we're going to turn to Dr. Sumner. And it's such a pleasure to welcome Dr. Sumner, who has a very long association and made major contributions to the work of the American Enterprise Institute and, of course, to the work that has globally been done on agricultural economics. Dan, it's a pleasure to welcome you in.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Vince. Do I get as much time as Glenn took, or how much Barry took?
You get Glenn.
And my slides are going to be up soon, I hope?
Barry's in charge, Dr. Goodwin is in charge of your slides.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm going to move very quickly. The recent attention to, and I'm a little disoriented because I hear myself with a delay and an echo, so I don't quite know how to do this. The action at the states has gotten lots of attention over the years, and the action seems to be moving federally. Now that's happening slowly, and we'll see. And I'm going to talk about why this may well be a farm bill issue, not just Massachusetts or California or Ohio, or for that matter, Manitoba issue. And I don't know if people can see my slides online or not. I don't see my slides. I see an AEI logo. Is that a problem with the?
No, just assume everybody can see your slides.
Okay, I'll assume so. I'm not sure the online people are getting that. Or maybe there's something else going on. I pulled out a few headlines over the last a few weeks and months from places like the places where policy really gets made is a local newspaper in Ohio, another farmer magazine in Nebraska, and then the New York Times with an online video presentation or podcast presentation from Ezra Klein. All of them focusing on the idea of what are we going to do about farm animals and the way they're treated. And now it's time to bring this into the Farm Bill. And I just want to remind people that though the headlines have been on state issues, that the current policy issues, there's national stuff. My favorite is the New York Times, and it really all over the web, and that's how people are treating octopuses as farm animals. And in fact, this is a global issue. There was recently a farm in Spain that was going to have farm raised octopi or octopuses, and they're being blocked for the sort of reasons that people apply to other animals. That is, they seem to feel things, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I will say the treatment of animals and animal public goods or externalities or claims of public goods or externalities are very widespread. And what you'll find is a group like, for example, the Humane Society, which focuses on how farm animals are treated, will be the first to jump to say greenhouse gas emissions from animals are some huge percentage of global greenhouse gases. They will point to local air quality and water quality and odor issues, health issues, nutritionists discouraging people from consuming animal products will point to greenhouse gases as though that were a nutrition issue, or animal treatment on farms as though that were a nutrition issue. So these all go together, but one of them is the last three or four I mentioned there. And of course, Barry was just talking about some livestock feeding operations having relatively high revenues. They also have very high costs of operations, of course, because they're buying livestock and buying feed going through. But how livestock are treated is something that many people find unpleasant to contemplate. The very fact of slaughter, the thought about it, and short lifespans for that matter, people find unpleasant. And then there's a group of people, and probably a growing group, though it's hard to tell. I think the very idea of consuming animals and raising animals in any way, for that matter, is simply immoral. And that's something I think that we no longer dismiss. I wrote about some of these things earlier this month in a AEI harvest, monthly harvest, I guess we call it, where I focused on federal regulations. The main points of that was that currently the federal government leaves aside housing and treatment of farm animals. And in fact, at least on farms, we have very tight federal regulations for how animals are treated in the last few hours before slaughter. FSIS, Food Safety and Inspection Service, has farm animal treatment regulations, interestingly enough, about the humane treatment of animals in slaughterhouses, not or in and around slaughterhouses, not on farms. The other animal regulations, animal welfare regulations, they're called at USDA, leave out farm animals explicitly. But many states, of course, have farm animal treatment regulations. And one argument for the federal regulation would be to preempt the kind of rules, and I'm on the next slide now, the one on summary of the main points, is the argument that federal legislation could preempt state by state rules and ensure some national consistency. And there have been times the animal agricultural industry have been supporting a federal regulation that would take that role. But another is to generally raise federal standards that would, in a sense, improve from their point of view what's done in individual states. What I suggest is something that Barry and Glenn were also suggesting, which is why don't we pay attention to the power of buyer preferences and transparency and setting policy goals that are consistent and being clear about that. And that'll get us to better policy in general. And I'll talk about that. I do want to emphasize that there are a group of people that are now in a position to be influential in the Farm Bill. Senator Booker is certainly one, but House members as well, that play leadership roles and very forceful roles that are generally, I would say, broadly hostile is the best word I can say about animal agriculture as it's now done in every way. And in Senator Booker's case, especially the practice of animal agriculture, whether it's housing or other treatment of animals on farms. And I do think that's something for the animal industry to pay close attention to, and for that matter, people who consume animal products. The I do I encourage we focus on treatment and housing or be farm practices as opposed to using the term welfare, which is something we frankly know almost nothing about. It's natural for us to want to anthropomorphize animals, to think we know how they feel about things. Um, anybody who looks at that literature and thinks about it realizes that is hard. And I will, for this talk and in my work, I avoid the welfare term where possible and focus on the words animal treatment. The term animal rights, which you'll sometimes see, is even more fraught with really legal details, among other things. And it's really troublesome for the kind of work that policies that we're talking about here. Let me turn to a quick example, one that is currently in front of I call it a Supreme controversy. The Supreme Court will rule on this soon. California had a proposition that set some rules for the handful of hogs, sows. This is all mother sows, a handful of sows that are in California, maybe two handfuls. But it applied it to any pork of certain kinds of cuts of pork consumed in California. It ends up being probably 8% of the North American sows supply pork for California. Significant part of pork is shipped out of North America, and certainly the piglet and sow industry, as we're going to hear in the next presentation, is it's about beef, but the same thing applies to pork. It's an integrated North American industry. So you've seen some numbers where people say 13% of pork consumption in the United States is in California. That's about right. It's also totally irrelevant to the issue of how sows are treated. California had a rule that's currently being evaluated nationally that set some rules on sows farrowing for pork that's consumed in California. So that's about 8% of the sows, something in that range, probably 8%. A number of them in Canada, by the way, particularly Manitoba. And then, because this was set as a consumer standard, similar to Cool in that way, it raises costs all the way through the process, particularly slaughtering. Not much, frankly, on the live animals, but particularly slaughtering, further processing, distributing, and all the way through. So that if you have to label and trace and monitor, and California inspectors have to make sure this is handled properly, and a Safeway store that sells a hog destined for Oregon in a Safeway in California, they're in terrible trouble. All of those things raise costs. And the work that we've done points out that you have some compliant hogs. That's, like I say, about 8% of the sows. And the only thing that's regulated really is the uncooked cuts of pork that are retailed inside California. Those Californians pay for, and the rest of the market doesn't have to pay. The other 95% of the pork in North America doesn't have to pay for California standards. At least that's the results of our work. And this just shows you the kind of, it's only the fresh market cuts. Anything cooked or mixed this doesn't apply, even in California, if and when this ever actually gets enforced in California. So where are we now? We're at a point where if this were implemented in California, the uncooked cuts of pork would cost about 20 cents more. It's about 7%, based on a benchmark of a couple of years ago. It's around $300 million a year that California consumers voted to charge themselves, or to charge each other, I should say. Because, of course, people that are vegans get to vote too, or people that for religious or other reasons don't consume pork could also vote to raise the price of pork for those that do buy pork. So this $300 million a year, if this is actually implemented, would be paid by those people that consume cuts of pork, not, for example, cooked ham or lunch meat. So where are we currently now on these questions? The National Pork Producers sued the California Secretary of Agriculture, Karen Ross, a friend of many of us. She's the secretary, so she gets sued. The constitutional issue was not state protectionism in a normal way, in the way it was used for eggs, for example, a few years ago, because California doesn't have any pork industry to protect. So that wasn't the issue. The claim in California was that we're more moral than the rest of people in North America. So therefore, we want but not so moral that we want to change generally how pork sows are treated in North America. We only care about the sows that are producing meat that get to California. Supreme Court heard this argument, and the major claim was that this would have devastating effects on the national pork industry and the supply chain, all the way through consumers in the whole country, not just in California. Rich Sexton and I and Han Lee would argue that that wasn't correct, but the U.S. government, so that just sort of economic factual part of the argument from the pork producers wasn't right. I'll leave aside the legal claims, which are beyond my expertise. The Supreme Court heard the arguments in October. They'll decide soon. Interestingly, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, sided with the pork producers and against the Humane Society and the state of California. That doesn't that kind of thing where the federal government and the Justice Department in California on the other are on different sides doesn't happen very often. But the issue is likely to be resolved on whether one state is allowed to impose its values and practices on other states. And that would be whether it's minimum wage policy or abortion policy or companies that impose rules about surgery for children that want to change their gender identities. So it's interesting. Those of us that pay attention to livestock thought, of course, the case might be about pork. I suspect when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's really about a whole range of things other than pork. But we'll see. I do want to say we proposed a policy that is Rich and Hanben and I that I think would be non-controversially totally. That is to say, if California wanted to spend $300 million a year to make sure that sows had more housing, there's a simple way to do it. Buy it. Notice, because they had a bunch of rules that went all the way through the tracing system, California was going to impose a cost on its consumers, which amounted to about $120 a square foot. Those of you that live in Washington, D.C., that would be about $10,000 a month for a typical 1,000 square foot apartment. That's what Californians are willing to pay to give sows a little more space. But because we're paying so much, it only covers about 600,000 of them. We could cover 2 million sows with that amount of money if we simply said to farmers, we'll pay you to give your sows more space. That would cover more like almost a third, maybe 25% of the sows in North America could be covered by that if Californians used their $300 million effectively. I would propose that could also be done federally. So you could put a fund together and say hog farmers that want to convert to something that some people like better for sows, pay farms to do it. That would be something that the pork industry is probably unlikely to oppose. Let me stop there, Vince.
Well, thanks, Dan. And you're much more like Barry Goodwin than you were, Glenn. Our final presenter, Dr. Michael Taylor, is going to focus on country of origin labeling, which Dan briefly mentioned. And country of origin labeling is a policy that lots of people love in Congress, and then when they find they're violating international trade rules, decide, oh, well, we'll try and modify it. So it's a policy that is a little bit like the Cheshire Cat that comes and goes and comes again. But Dr. Taylor has done some of the seminal work on understanding the implications of country of origin labeling, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you, Vince. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here. And I'm going to take a few moments to discuss mandatory country of origin labeling. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the timeline, because I think that this is an issue that we've seen before. It's come, it's gone, and if we don't recognize what happened the first time around, we may make some steps that don't help the situation very much. So I'll give a little bit of a background. The 2002 Farm Bill was amended to require retailers to tell customers the country of origin labeling, or the country of origin of muscle cut and ground meats from several different species, including beef and pork. And after many years of debating the issue and making revisions, the final rule became effective in March 2009. It's worth noting that processed meat products and meat purchased at restaurants were categories that were exempt from mandatory country of origin labeling, which is about half of all beef consumption. So what we're talking about here is meat that is for sale in the grocery store, for example. MCOOL ended following the adoption of COOL for all covered commodities. The WTO found in 2012 that the law violated the technical barriers to trade agreement. So the WTO ruled that the U.S. government could not require COOL on meat products, and that was brought in by Canadian and Mexican cattle producers against the U.S. So as a result, the U.S. repealed COOL in December 2015. And so MCOOL lasted for exactly 82 months. It started in March 2009 and it ended in December 2015. And that may seem like a long time ago, but it's not really that long ago in terms of the impacts. So the for and against, those who are proponents of COOL argue that customers have a right to know where their food comes from. There were several consumer preference studies that were conducted prior to MCOOL implementation that showed consumers had a willingness to pay for a premium. They paid a premium for origin information. And so if consumers truly are willing to pay more, then the cost of MCOOL implementation could be offset. So that was the idea, right? If consumers want this information and they're willing to pay more for it, then we may be able to offset some of the costs of implementing it. But we have to think about those costs. And one of the things to note is that the opponents of COOL say that with a non-voluntary labeling system, you've got the cost of maintaining and providing this information on where the animals were born, raised, and slaughtered. And what we have is an industry that is very disaggregated at the cow-calf level, where we have cow-calf producers all over the country that will aggregate some of their animals to background and as stockers, and then will aggregate again to sell them. And then where my home state in Alabama, where we have a lot of cow-calf producers, they will sell their calves and they will get shipped to Kansas, where they will get fed out and then eventually end up at slaughter facilities in the Great Plains. So there's a lot of disaggregation in this industry, and trying to keep track of where these animals were born, raised, and slaughtered is a real challenge when there's changing hands throughout the system. The other thing to keep in mind is that we are bringing in animals from Mexico and Canada, and those animals also have to be tracked in terms of where they were born, raised, and slaughtered. So did country of origin labeling affect demand? And are we able to offset some of those costs of keeping track of those animals through the system? Well, Dr. Tonzer and I conducted an investigation in 2013 that looked at whether or not beef and pork demand were impacted by MCOOL. And the thing that is important about this study is that, as opposed to the willingness to pay studies that were conducted prior to MCOOL implementation, we were able to look at actual purchases that were conducted, and we were able to look at these using scanner data from grocery stores from February 2007 to March 2011. So that's important because we have 2 years prior of implementation to track demand and see what people's behavior is, and then we have 2 years after implementation to see whether or not their behavior changed. And using the scanner data allowed us to look for substitution patterns between products that were covered and those that were not, as to whether or not people changed their buying behavior. And so we modeled different periods of time to allow consumers to become familiar with the new implementation. So we didn't assume that as soon as COOL was implemented that people changed their behavior, but we gave them some time to be able to learn about the system and learn about the labeling and maybe make changes to their decisions over time as well. So if MCOOL implementation created benefits for US consumers by filling an information gap with valued information that the market was not providing voluntarily to consumers, then we would expect to observe a response in the demand for covered products. And across several different model iterations, the investigation yielded no evidence of a change in demand following implementation of MCOOL, and that was for either beef or pork. And it's important to note that these findings are similar to those from the Kuchler et al. Paper, which was looking at a related assessment of MCOOL that did not significantly affect the demand for shrimp. Something a little more recent, actually, Dr. Tonzer put this chart up earlier, and I wasn't going to get out of here without putting a chart up, as any good economist would, right? So here's my chart. What this says is that looking at people who are meat purchasers and the issues that they find important, what you'll see is that origin and traceability is in the bottom 3 of their concerns or their issues that they are looking at when it comes to whether or not they're buying meat and what kind of meat they're buying. And so it's important to note that that origin traceability issue is not top of the list for consumers today. So just a few conclusions. I think it's willing to note that consumers who are interested in origin information, they do get picked up by those willingness to pay surveys, but they represent a relatively small portion of the market. And there is the opportunity for those consumers to buy labeled beef, to buy local beef, to buy freezer beef. Those opportunities are out there for them, but looking at something that would cover the entire industry in a mandatory fashion, which is what we're looking at with country of origin labeling, did not increase demand for meat when it was in place, but it did increase supply chain costs, making it a costly value proposition. And so those are my comments on MCOOL, and I will certainly take questions when we come to the Q&A later.
Well, just before Greg provides his perspectives and the broader perspectives from the industry, thank you for the brevity and constructiveness of
Yes,
your
you're welcome.
presentation, Dr. Sumner, Dr. Goodwin. And I can only be rude to Dr. Sumner and Dr. Goodwin because I've known both of them for 40 years. And they are both very important people in the world of agricultural policy. Greg, what's your view on this new set of initiatives that's coming out of the Biden administration to some extent, but also to some extent from folks in the Senate and the House who are not Democrats but Republicans?
Well, Vincent, I've got just a few minutes here. I want to give you a little perspective on all of these issues.
Absolutely.
From a farm boy from Kansas. And what people need to know is that I grew up on a farm in Kansas. I'm still a partner in a cow-calf operation. Grew up raising hogs and cattle. Still own part of the farm. And grew up in the hometown of Mankato, Kansas, where if you know where that is, that was one of the Dubuque packing plant. So I grew up in the hometown of a meat processing plant that closed when I graduated from high school in 1985. Because they refused to switch it from swinging sides to boxed beef back when that transition was made. I also want to say, Vincent, that thank you for having me here. And what you didn't realize is that I know Glenn is here, but the original speaker, Dr. Ted Schroeder, and Dr. Barry Goodwin were my 2 major professors in Ag Econ for my graduate program at Kansas State. So that was a day or 2 ago. But I've still, all these years, I've flown back and forth to the farm in Kansas. And I want to, on these issues, I want to raise everybody and go back to a study that was commissioned 20 years ago by USDA that looked at the efficiency and the competition issues in the livestock industry. It was a study done by RTI, and it is still the requisite study on this topic in America. And I'll just sum it up very quickly. I was in a meeting early in the Obama administration with the economists at the Department of Justice as we were reviewing this study with a group of PhD ag economists. And those DOJ economists, and it was a fascinating several-hour conversation, they had absolutely come to the conclusion that this was not market power that was being exhibited in the livestock industry. And in fact, what they concluded was what the livestock industry indicated in terms of where the facilities were located, the size of these facilities, they were almost perfectly efficient. And to the point that was made, they're still that way today. And this is a critically important point in layman's terms. Why? Because what we're about in agriculture is farmers get paid more for their product and consumers pay less for their product. And if you have a very efficient processing industry in between, that allows you to do that. Now, most of the advocates that I've ever spoken with, and I've spoken with them for over 20 years, that don't think this system is right, everything that they advocate for is for more cost in processing. What does that get you at the end of the day? Producers get less and consumers pay more. This is basic economics, folks. There's no way around this. And so that is one of the first points that we have to make when we talk about these things. In terms of country of origin labeling, this issue, I grew up, or I worked for a guy that was something about America First. I can't remember, what that was all about. Kidding. Obviously, we need to eat American steak and things in this country, but the thing that frustrates me about country of origin labeling, always has, is that the whole notion of how producers get ahead by this notion is that we shrink the industry. You have less. So I would ask my colleagues here on the panel, I've never been able to come up with another industry in the United States that has actually gotten ahead by shrinking. You can come up with one, I'd love to hear it, maybe there is. But that's the whole notion of this. And in terms of, I've done trade in this town in a lot of different commodities for some 30 years, and meat trade is one of the most fascinating things that there is. Love talking about it and working on it. And I want to kind of give you a quick example here. We import a lot of meat from Canada. But did you know half of that is 50-50 trim that goes to California to make fast food hamburgers? We actually export some $800-900 million worth of beef to Canada as well. Why? Because 80% of the cattle in Canada are in Alberta, out west. All of the people in Canada live in Toronto in the east. So I ask a question for all of you. Who is closer to the people of Toronto, Canada? Calgary, Alberta, or Grand Island, Nebraska, where the JBS plant is? The answer is Grand Island, Nebraska is almost exactly 1,000 miles closer to Toronto than Calgary is. So this trade is about efficiency in terms of diesel fuel. Why do these things flow the way they do? Because of proximity and distance and location. It's not complicated. There is a very logical way that we do this. And I'm going to close with one comment in terms of the animal rights and animal activism side of this. There is an outstanding book that was written last fall by one of my colleagues, Ray Starling. So I worked at USTR in the White House. I was one of Robert Lighthizer deputies. Ray Starling was the guy that worked for Cohn and Larry Kudlow at the National Economic Council at the White House. He was a national FFA officer, brilliant guy. He was Sonny Perdue's chief of staff. He's written a book called Farmers versus Foodies. You should all get that book and read that book. It is one of the best contemporary looks at all of these issues that we have today, and it's a requisite, to me, it's required reading for any land grant undergraduate kid. So with that, Vincent?
Well, thanks, Greg. I'm going to take a moment or two to throw some issues back at the panel for their thoughts. There's a theme here. We are looking at proposals for mandatory minimum use by the industry, by farmers and processors of cash markets with the claim this will improve information for farmers and improve their welfare. Country of origin labeling has demonstrably failed to provide any benefits, whether we're talking about clothing. Buy America clothing was a big issue in the 90s, or cauliflower, or livestock products, or pretty much any products anywhere in the world. Why are we seeing both people on the right and people on the left, sort of in the middle, but on the right and the left, pushing for mandatory use of specific marketing methods for beef, changing the way in which tournaments are operated, bringing back country of origin labeling, imposing animal treatment requirements? Why are we seeing this move at this time? And does any of this make any real sense? Who is pushing for these rules? Because it's not just people concerned about humane treatment of animals, it's people within the livestock industry who are pushing for these rules as well. Why are we seeing this now and being taken so seriously by important and influential people on the House and Senate Ag committees?
I'll make a first comment. So particularly in the beef cattle industry, there's a lot of stakeholders, pun intended again for steak, in that industry, and a lot of diversity of thought. But that comment holds even more in our country, right? So our country's well over 300 million people. And I think it's a little naive to think that we're all going to hug and get along, right, when you have that much diversity. And a lot of the reason isn't about economics, in my opinion. You have a panel here that have economic perspectives on this, and if you heard the tone of all our presentations, we have concerns with this from an economist perspective. But I think there's quite a few non-economic reasons, other political and some would say ethical and so forth, depending on the topic, that continue to bring it up, that are from a divisive, we're a divided country in many ways. And specific to the beef cattle industry, there's parts of this that it's a divided industry. But that's not necessarily new. So that's also why I don't think it's going to go away. I think 20 years from now, we're going to be having some discussion around cool again, right? Regardless of what we do next week on it. So I think that's what it's like to be in America.
Barry, Dr. Goodwin, what's your perspective?
Well, I don't think the industry itself, poultry producers are not pushing for this because I think it's working quite well for them. So where it's coming from, there's a perception that there's problems there that actually may not exist, and trying to change the rules to address problems that don't actually exist. So beyond that, I'd like to hear what Greg has to say on this, because he's been in the thick of this for many years.
Thank you.
No, go ahead.
There's nothing new. These conversations have been going on in this town for decades, and they will continue to go on for decades. But there was a famous ag policy professor at Kansas State that described it this way, that politics in this country are not linear. It's a circle, and this topic is a quintessential situation where the far left and the far right have come so far around that their fannies are touching. And that's what we see here. But the other part of this that I've always seen in this town, in my 30 years in this town, Vincent, is there are a group of people that just don't believe markets work. They don't believe in markets. They believe that government needs to have their thumb on the scale in some sort of fashion or another. And, there's always going to be that tension.
And may I quickly interject on that?
Yes.
Is, most economists would say there is a role of information exchange in a market. And I quickly made the comment about livestock mandatory reporting, right? And the history of why that's there.
I had that on my list of coming back questions for you.
So that's part of why that now exists, right? Is in 1998, hogs were very cheap in this country, and there was comments about information asymmetry, right? The buyer knew more than the seller. Let's fix that was kind of the dialogue at the time. Again, others can add to that, but that's my summary of that. That led the political push to give us LMR. Now it's evolved over time, but my opinion is USDA has more information to work with to subsequently disseminate back out. And that has helped make markets more efficient, actually, which most economists I think would agree with that. So I interject that because there at times is a role for government policy, is the reason I say that.
In terms of transparency,
If
absolutely.
it adds information, it improves the market functioning, if you heard how I described that, I think there's value in that. So I at least am not 100% a government anti-policy at all costs. That's not the point here. But it needs to be in response to a problem. And that example was there an information gap that could be improved? My opinion is LMR has helped with that. There's always room for evolution on that. Yeah.
So
I don't think you can ignore COVID when you're thinking about these proposals that are out right now, and the fact that there was this disruption that was seen as something that's a permanent change. We have to go in and fix this now. So
In fact, I had this conversation at the White House at the time, and let me tell you how I explain this. In the poultry industry, we can fix these kinds of problems in 6 weeks. All we have to do is break the eggs, and we can bring supply and demand back in balance. In the pork industry, the way I describe it is it's like Lucy. Remember the old skit Lucy at the chocolate factory? Where the chocolate just keeps coming and she's trying to sort it out and it all ends up on the floor?
Yes, yes.
I love Lucy. That's the pork industry. And that's what happened during COVID is everything went on the floor. We couldn't keep everything going. There were stuff spilling out on the floor. The cattle industry is very different, and this is where the frustration is. We didn't have any wreck in the cattle industry. Why? Because you can back those cattle up all the way through the chain. Where's the frustration? It'll take you a year to bring that inventory back to current as a result of that. So you don't have any wreck at the front end. We didn't even really feel it in the cattle industry. But it takes you a long time after that to bring everything back to current. And that's where a lot of the frustration was that in that year period after this occurred, well, why isn't the market performing like it should? Because you had inventory overhanging the market. You had everything backed up.
Michael, what's your view?
Well, so I'm originally from Montana, and I remember when NAFTA was put into place. And we had Montana cattle producers who were watching potloads of cattle come across the border from Canada. And there was this very grassroots concern that we were losing our market to Canada, when in reality, when you look at the bigger picture, there's this great efficiency that happens when you integrate these markets. But I think at the grassroots level, people feel like things are not working for them, and that's where you get some of this push. And that's what we have to, it's important that we have these kinds of conversations so that we can convey that bigger picture.
Briefly, to Barry's point on COVID at least has a role in this. I think a lot of our society is more skeptical and not trusting of experts than they were 4 years ago. That's not just an economics thing, that's general. I mean, that started with medical experts, but it spilled over. And I think that magnifies some of the perceptions that markets don't work, or if an expert says they do, we don't believe them, and so forth, which has probably made it more challenging sitting here in 2023.
Dan, what's your perspective on this really new flush of ideas about regulating the livestock sector, not just with respect to animal treatment, but beyond?
Yeah, the two issues that I'm familiar with, one is Cool, where I've worked on it since, 2007 or so. And now we're redoing Cool, calling it voluntary Cool, with administrative action, not with legislation. And that issue has been a long time. I don't think it has anything to do with trusting experts or not. Similarly, with the animal welfare issue, it seems to me that is like a lot of these kinds of things spread to us from Europe mostly, and we have rich people further and further disengaged from what agricultural reality is, and they really don't want to hear about it. And that means if they can force themselves and everybody else to avoid thinking about the fact of slaughter and the fact of how animals are normally going to be treated on farms to make food affordable to normal people, they want to avoid it. So there's a elitist attitude, if I can call it that, but it's, of course, the influential elitist attitude. And I wouldn't attribute that to anything very new, really. It's been building for a very long time.
So do we have questions from people in the audience here? please.
Hi. I actually went to college in Dubuque, Iowa, where Dubuque Packing Company was started. I thought that was fun to hear. So as blockchain becomes more integrated in ag production, we're probably like quite a few years out from that. Dr. Taylor, I saw with your research that like animal treatment and like environmental impacts are very high on the list for consumers. Do you think that once that information is required to be in their face, like whether through a rule by some agency or something, that will affect the market more than it does now?
With regard to environmental considerations, is that what you're, just for clarity?
Just with what people are interested in purchasing and I guess costs to producers, like maybe there'd be a higher incentive to adopt some market practice that's
Sure.
more palatable.
Well, I'll start and then I'll let Glenn finish. But I think that anytime that we can, as a market, respond to what consumers are interested in, there's an opportunity there, right? So if consumers are interested in certain characteristics of their meat, then the opportunity for producers to offer that is an important part of how the market works. And there's value there. There's an opportunity there. So if it's environmental, if it's welfare, if it's origin, whatever those things might be, the opportunity for voluntarily providing that information in the market is what we want to look for. I don't know if anybody else wants to contribute to that, but.
Well, a brief clarification is important here because we both shared the same slide, and I'm the author behind it, so this is an important point. Is there's a list of 12 things there, and each U.S. resident since February of 20, every month over 2,000 people are asked, what are the 4 most important and the 4 least important factors in your protein purchasing decision out of 12? And the 4 you don't pick are, of course, an intermediate. Why am I clarifying that? This is a forced rank decision, and environmental impact and origin traceability and animal welfare are on the bottom in a forced rank environment. Other surveys that just ask, is this important to you? We get a high percentage yes. Everything's important, right? That's kind of the free lunch we want it all. But as soon as you put it in a forced rank, you get different findings. And I remind us of that because price is the 3rd or 4th most important. And by the way, it's grown a lot in the last 9 months, given inflation and so forth. So there's this constant economic trade-off to this. That's a clarification point, is environmental impact and the like are really important to some, but not as important as other things is the important component of that. And for those that's important for, it's already a voluntary labeling opportunity, potentially as blockchain and more generally information exchange gets better, so it's trusted more and or cheaper to implement, then there'll be more of those opportunities that can be seized. And I'm all for that, but please note that's a voluntary opt-in by the production chain that matches the voluntary buyer, is the way I describe that.
Great.
I want to
So,
follow up on
let me ask
something
you a
Dr.
quick
Sumner
question.
said.
Just
And
a
that
very
is
quick question.
the wealthy people that are talking about how we don't know what we're doing in agriculture. And I hearken back to my many years at the cattlemen and the old ranchers, and they said, we'll tell you about the good old days. The good old days sucked. And the point being today is if you had, I wish I could articulate to everyone the data, the technology, the information that we have to know that these cows are happy, that they're productive. We know exactly when they're stressed, and we know exactly what to do to remedy that situation, to prevent disease, and to deal with this, to make sure that these cows are as healthy and productive as pigs as they possibly can be. And the amount, and this is what I work on today in agriculture, 5 years from now, the changes that are coming due to this technology are just mind-bending to me. We are really good at this today, and where we are going is just going to be so much better, you can't believe it.
But real quickly, my phone comment, you have to make the phone to where a consumer wants it, not just the information being available in a tool. It won't be implemented unless there's value with it. So simply blockchain coming around won't add value unless it's in a way that aligns with something that somebody wants to buy.
Dan, did you want to comment on this?
Well, I just had a quick question, and that is, I honestly didn't understand Glenn's chart. And in particular, I don't know what the minus signs mean.
There's some zero, Dan.
So this, all of the charts on here have to add, the numbers have to add to 0.
Yes.
So the mean is imposed at 0.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we don't observe the mean preferences.
Because I'm making you tell me 4 that are least important.
No, I understood that. Okay, I got it. I'll follow it up with you later.
Sure.
So an external comment is, you're all just saying no. And I mean, that's my read as well, by the way. No to messing with the tournament process for poultry because it will harm both producers, processors, and consumers by increasing costs. No to country of origin labeling because it increases costs, which means lower farm gate prices and higher consumer prices to cover those costs in the supply chain. No to mandatory changes in how beef is sold by requiring minimum amounts to go through cash sales, where prices are published because it's auction-like, because of the quality and price effects of those sorts of initiatives. And if we must insist on changes in how hogs are treated, have the taxpayer pay, but don't go through the regulatory process and have farmers voluntarily decide whether or not they want to change their production methods given subsidies being offered.
Why not let the consumer voluntarily decide what they want to spend their money on, rather than imposing this, on all pork in California? Let's let the consumer decide. Label it if it's compliant or not, and then let the market sort it out.
And labeling is sufficiently cheap there.
Yeah, I mean, it's segregating the product may be a problem, but again, that's, how much are you willing to pay as a customer for this particular product that you think has some characteristic that you value?
If you want it, actually put up the money. Don't tell a surveyor.
Yeah, it's like,
I like this.
it's like local foods I see in Chapel Hill where I live. Everybody thinks it's a great idea, but they still go to the grocery store and buy their product. And money is the best voting mechanism there is. So,
Vince, a quick add-on is, and this gets to the willingness to pay statements too, is we get a lot of products. Let's use the hog example. Is there probably is a subset of the U.S. population willing to pay a premium for a pork chop produced a certain way.
Yes.
But good luck finding the same percentage that are folks willing to pay for sausage and bacon and ham and tongue and hocks. I mean, I'll stop there. But the point is we get a lot of products off each barrel and gill. And the same comment goes for chicken and steers as well. The economics about this, some of it goes back to how the live animal is produced and tracked. And then subsequently, some of those products stay at home, get exported, whatever. And there may be a real demand for pork chops, but it's not sufficient to cover the cost of the entire production thing. And I know that sounds complicated, but part of my no in some of this is because the aggregate economics don't make sense, even when in some disaggregated little markets that might exist.
So
I will tell you, one other thing is, in this country, private sector, here's the goal, whether it's climate change or animal, whatever we're doing, and get the private sector to work to attain that goal is a much more efficient system than the European system of government mandates.
So let's be clear here. We've been discussing actually policy proposals that are currently being considered in the 2023 Farm Bill exercise, looking towards a new Farm Bill. And in the livestock area, some of the high-profile regulatory proposals are about access to information on prices for cattle sold, on the potential for market power to distort markets, hurting farmers and hurting consumers. It seems to me that you all are saying those are misplaced concerns. And another way to put it would be there are cheaper ways of improving information in the marketplace through mandatory live reporting, for example. None of you is saying there should be no regulation of livestock operations in general. Is that correct? We're talking about environmental regulations and so on. What you're talking about here and what this session has been designed to bring to the public debate is among the proposals to add regulations, are there those that make sense or are there those that really make no sense, even if they may be popular, from the point of view of the consumer, the producer, and the processor? Of the regulations that are currently being talked about, are there any that you think would be worthwhile putting in place, just as a conclusion to this session? And I want to go around everybody. So Greg, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think without question, anything we can do to enhance transparency is important. And there are lots of different ways to do that. And I think, Dr. Tonser, as you indicated, I mean, there are hundreds of people at USDA that work really well and hard to do this every day. And is it perfect? No. There are always lots of things that you can do to enhance it. On the environmental side of the equation, of course, there are things that we can do to enhance it, as we should. But I just don't think government mandates are the most efficient, from an economist and market standpoint, the most efficient way to do that.
Dan.
You know, Vince, when it comes to animal welfare, and I'll stick with that.
Okay.
Federal preemption could make sense in some cases to reduce the amount of market chaos that a whole variety of state regulations might do. And not only that, I think there may well be some public good aspects. It may not just be that I care about how the animal's treated that I eat, but there may be public good aspects to how as a society we treat animals. So I would not dismiss that out of hand. And what I call for is a thorough debate about that to see where we stand as a society. But we currently have zero farm animal treatment rules from the federal government. That may be the optimal, but it's not obvious.
But don't dive in irresponsibly.
I'd say it's worth some thorough discussion. The problem, of course, it's, as we've heard, it's an ideological sort of a thing where you're for or against agriculture as we do it. And we know that there's lots of elite claiming the whole food system is broken and we need to start over again because evidently we've all been starving recently.
Not according to my waistline. Michael.
I would just say from the perspective of country of origin labeling that we've been down this path before. We don't need to go down this path again with regard to mandatory labeling. The opportunity for voluntary labeling and letting the market work between the producers and consumers that are interested in that topic needs to be the focus.
Barry.
I was just going to say transparency as well, but I would just point out again with these executive communications on the poultry tournament, there is a limit to how much somebody should be forced to disclose. And when you're getting into this situation of putting all this information out that the tournaments are using, perhaps there's too much information being shared in that case. So usually we don't think that as economists. We always like more information, but you know there is a business information that should be held.
Glenn, you have 60 seconds for the final word.
So I'm going to go back to LMR because it's a mechanism for the transparency in this. I mean, I continue to think there's ways for that to evolve and continue to get better, but in the way that it becomes a mirror on how the private industry operates. That's very different than being a market maker in the industry, right? So I think there's room for that. And whatever action we take, we need to learn from it as well. So there's a pilot program in the cattle contract library space, motivated in the spirit of more transparency. Sitting here today, March 2023, I think an accurate assessment is we don't know exactly what we're learning from that, and that's okay. It's what's called a pilot program. So let's learn from things during a pilot program before we take additional action. That would be my healthy suggestion.
So let's look before we leap. And on that note, let's thank the panel for the really interesting presentations and even more interesting discussion. Thank you very much, all 5 of you.